Recently, I set up AWF after working in Mostar and Bosnia after my graduate studies in the US in the mid-1990s. And I set it up with the purpose that we would deliberately deliver projects for vulnerable communities, or use design as a tool to rebuild cities who were either divided by war or conflict, or different levels of vulnerability, whether that be poverty, health, etc., etc. And it had a long gestation as an organisation, because we started off really as a volunteer network. It's only really been in the last 10 years that I think we've come into our stride, in terms of we have 12 corporate sponsors who underwrite the organisation. So we only have paid staff, because I found that managing volunteers was too crazy. I think we have a very good board. Most of this is on our website. So a lot of our time has also gone into restructuring the organisation so that all the board members are only based in my city in Melbourne, because before COVID it meant a lot that we were all in the same place. Obviously that's not any longer relevant. The chair of the board is a lawyer, so very good at administration and governance issues and running things. And I think that's what I found, that involving non-architects and people with other experience at that board level were sort of critical. So we've got somebody who's got auditing experience, somebody who's got media experience and other things like that, because I think a lot of these organisations are only architects run, and I think that's a problem. If you want to grow bigger, you need these different sort of disciplines on it. So we only go where we're invited. If there's a disaster somewhere, we don't go in and say we're available. We only ask, where we're asked to do a specific project. If it's been a project in Africa, we'd only ever do it if there was a local person there to work with, because we're not interested in taking anyone's job or expertise, only where we can sort of get a project off the ground. So we've never got any government funding. We've got small amounts of private sector small amounts of donor funding, but it's really been through this network funding where the corporate sponsors, who are all big built environment firms, landscape architecture, construction management, civil engineering, quantity surveyors, who pay the equivalent of $12,000 a year each to underwrite the organisation, that we have a sort of firm financial base.
That's awesome. And then in your, you've got such a rich experience, especially with your organization, your view on the current humanitarian crisis with the war in Afghanistan, and then the refugees that are coming down to different African countries, what are some of the principles you feel African countries should know about embracing refugees from different areas? What are some of those principles we should know in terms of architecture or design as we embrace refugees coming from other countries?
Look, I mean, I guess I tend to, it's not an area I'm expert in, but I work with a lot of site and settlement planners who work with UNHCR and other organisations who are deployed to the field. So I think it's hard to make a general set of guidelines, but I guess one of the things is that if the settlement or shelter planning isn't generally tied to generating employment, like after the tsunami, if reconstruction isn't put hand in hand with economic development, it's likely to be doomed. Now, it's very problematic in areas where people are going to they're only in a transition zone. Generally, I learned after the tsunami, other places I've worked like Bosnia and Haiti, that if reconstruction wasn't tied to kind of economic redevelopment or re-leveraging, that it was a waste of time. And I would say it's the same with all of our projects. If we're not adding to the general economy by doing our projects, then we'd have to kind of wonder why we're there. So I think obviously in northern Uganda, they're sort of, they've handled things quite well, as I understand. A lot better than in other places in terms of the settlement planning. And then, it's so, I guess, region specific. I was in Syria, in Jordan, about 4 or 5 years ago and saw the work they were doing there with settlement planning, obviously where kids were kind of going to school and where there was health and education. And I guess the bottom line is that where design and planning are linked to health and education outcomes in terms of generating a strong, local economy, then things tend to work. People just go in and sort of drop projects that aren't linked to health and education outcomes. And the biggest problem, I think, in the shelter and settlement field is that they're not really, there's no evaluation in terms of happening, in terms of, what works and what doesn't, and according to whom. So the lack of a sort of an evidence base is a real problem, I know, in the sector.
So it would seem then that if we have a disaster with war, it's different from the way we'd handle a disaster, say, with a flood, like we've just had in Cameroon at the border, and it's different from a disaster with a pandemic like COVID-19. So all these disasters in our cities, then, as I sense from you, are different. We definitely would handle them differently.
I think there are some general rules because obviously the biggest difference, for example, I lived in Lebanon, in Beirut for 3 years, where there is no sort of political system in place. Then it's a completely different sort of ball game to rebuilding after its recent floods, but not altogether. Even Germany wasn't equipped to deal with those floods. And the big problem is not enough time being put into disaster risk reduction measures and, disaster mitigation. I mean, that's what they say is that, $1 spent on disaster mitigation measures up front gives you $8, further down the country, further sort of down the way. But yeah, I mean, it's hard because it's sort of such a big topic, an interesting topic that you're raising, that there's so many sort of subsections and bits sort of in front of that. But
thanks, Prof. Shalsworth. I really appreciate your time.
Please call me Esther. Don't call me Professor. No one calls me that.